Before moving on to the emergence of the mad doctor, I should briefly mention a couple of other relevant factors relating to the organisation of medicine. Firstly, the emergence of the general practitioner, the GP, during the 18th century. Individuals trained in physic and surgery. They tended to have gone through one of the Scottish universities where they could take courses in all areas. They combined the roles of physician and surgeon and apothecary too. They formed the rank and file of medicine and in time became a major political force to be reckoned with. Indeed, the British Medical Association was established in 1832 as an organisation to campaign for their interests. It was this class of medical man, above all others, that the Lancet claimed to represent. Secondly, and directly relevant to the emergence of the psychiatrist as a specialist, right the way into the mid-19th century, being a specialist, that is someone who treated specific diseases or conditions, was completely and utterly frowned upon. Yes, it was okay to be a general practitioner because you could treat everything and you were cognizant of the broad dimensions of sickness and health. Yes, it was fine to be a physician who dealt with all medical problems or a surgeon who dealt with all things that required hands-on intervention. But to specialise on one part of the body or one particular disease was regarded as nothing less than quackery and was fought at every turn by many within the profession. This meant that to label yourself as a mad doctor or later alienist was in some ways to place yourself outside the mainstream of the profession, or at least put you in a position where your peers would frown upon you. Of course, it was inevitable given the increasing complexity of medicine and the breaking down of the old barriers between physicians and surgeons that specialisms would emerge. And we see early examples of this, like the proto-ophthalmologist at the Moorfields Hospital, which was set up in the mid-18th century and was roundly criticised. We see it in the man midwife, epitomised by William Hunter. And another example was, of course, mad doctoring itself. It was not until the late Victorian period that specialisation became socially or professionally acceptable. The aim was always to be a great all-rounder. This was the contextual background against which the emergence of psychiatry occurred. And what we'll find is this, that in general, those who sought to alleviate the pain of mental suffering tended to come from the ranks of the physicians, or at least were individuals who had a strong background in medicine. But we will also see that this was a source of considerable irony in and of itself, for much of what would go on in the asylum had very little to do with medicine and very much to do with the simple day-to-day management of individuals. From the early part of the 18th century, a new trade slowly grew and flourished, the trade in lunacy or mad doctoring. It was a time of rapid transformation when rising incomes and a growing middle class with money to spare created the first consumer society. Among the many new goods and services was the trade in lunacy, the creation of houses dedicated to the care of the mad. Prior to this period, most suffering from madness would have ended up in a workhouse or would have been constrained in attics or stables, often chained like wild beasts. Now a range of institutions for both the rich and the poor appeared. They were very much the forerunners of the asylums, and it was in these places that the first flowering of moral therapy occurred, and whilst many of them were disgusting and dangerous places, some did offer respite and care, and not every patient was left to rot, as the legend of Bedlam would have it. However, medicine's relationship with the madhouse was sometimes tenuous. You didn't need a qualification to be an owner or superintendent. Until the 1770s, nobody regulated the madhouses or the mad doctors, and then after that, only sporadically. It was a free-for-all, where many owners or superintendents were not medically qualified, sometimes a clergyman, sometimes from other more unlikely trades. The Prouds of Bilston were cordwainers, not the first occupation that comes to mind for managing the man. But there were qualified men who saw opportunity in mad doctoring for making a living, sometimes an extremely good living. The archetypal figure of the 18th century mad doctor was none other than John Munro, part of the Munro dynasty, which served as visiting physicians to the Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam, for 125 years. His father James had been the visiting physician, and his sons and his sons' sons would too. Munro was first and foremost connected with Bedlam, where he was appointed visiting physician in 1752, but his influence and activities stretched further than this iconic institution. Here we need a brief interlude to describe the significance of being appointed a visiting physician, or indeed surgeon, to a hospital. These positions were usually elected by a board of governors. They were unpaid, and the expectation was that you would rock up to the hospital 2 or 3 days a week for a couple of hours at a time. Who then would want such an unpaid post? Well, virtually all medical men were in private practice. They needed to get a living. There were a few who were paid poorly by the state and by the parishes. The board of governors of hospitals were usually wealthy and prestigious and sometimes titled, and they formed a wonderful network of potential patients for the appointee. It was essential, therefore, for any doctor to develop pleasing airs and graces that would satisfy their patron patients. Now, not only did a university degree help, a knowledge of the fine arts and the classics was essential. So too the demonstration of good taste, driving the right kind of carriage, and dressing in the right way. John Munro's father James possessed all of these qualities, and he made sure that John got them too by getting him educated at Oxford, where he got his MD in 1741. But these qualities didn't put the physician on an equal footing with their patients. Their manners and self-presentation merely helped to keep them in business. Physicians provided a very ethereal service, knowledge and advice, a strange craft. And as service providers, no matter how well developed their manners, they remain socially inferior and beholden to their patients. Munro's status was doubly questionable, for not only was he reliant on patronage for making his living, he had also chosen to be a mad doctor, a frowned-upon specialism that was sometimes the domain of the quack, with the added stigma of dealing with the mad. Munro and his sons were, however, able to walk this social tightrope and prosper, using their Bedlam connections to build a network of wealthy and powerful patrons. By the late 18th century, if a cartoonist were lampooning the behaviour of a politician, playing with the trope of political madness, it was usually Munro who appeared, diagnosing the politician as insane. He was the premier mad doctor of his day, the best known in all the land. But there were other highly lucrative strings to Munro's bow. He was the owner and superintendent of a string of madhouses spread throughout the capital city from Hackney to Chelsea. These provided a place for the genteel patients to be removed from their families and treated in relatively congenial surroundings, all of course for a fee. Now, Munro wasn't alone in creating and running madhouses aimed at wealthy families. One of the most famous of these was established in 1792 at Ticehurst in East Sussex by Samuel Newington. By the way, the institution still exists. It's the rural branch of the Priory where the celebs go to dry out. It's their favourite destination for rehab. Now, Newington was the local surgeon and apothecary. He wasn't a physician. Grateford Hall, Willis's endeavour, was less exclusive, but still geared towards the wealthy. And of course, there was the iconic retreat in York, established in the 1790s by the local Quakers as an antidote to the horrors of the York public madhouse. These were model institutions placed in idyllic rural settings, often with landscaped or beautiful gardens, providing quiet retreats from the hustle and bustle of the world, and could most definitely lay claim to being the direct forebears of the modern asylum. Now, of these, only Grateford was established by a physician, although he also happened to be a clergyman, while Ticehurst was the brainchild of a surgeon apothecary, the forerunner of the GP. William Tuke, who superintended at the retreat, had no medical training whatsoever, and it remained the case that throughout the whole period, the owner or superintendent of a madhouse did not have to be, and quite often was not, a medical man. So, mad doctoring was barely medicalised, and the authority of the physician turned mad doctor remained located as much in his manners as it did in his medical knowledge. Many of the madhouses did not just take in wealthy patients. Quite often they had a private and a public side. Hoxton House in East London is typical here. In terms of its size, it challenged the major public institutions of Bedlam and St Luke's. Parishes from all over the south of England would send pauper lunatics there, where they would be incarcerated in dirty and sometimes squalid surroundings. It's hard not to draw the conclusion that the mad doctors of Hoxton were most definitely in it for the money and not the cure. And while legislation in 1770 insisted that all madhouses be licensed, this was poorly enforced. The conditions on the public side of Hoxton and similar asylums were enough to trigger not one but two parliamentary inquiries in the early 19th century, and would eventually result in a more rigorous overhaul of the system. So these are the things we can say about the relationship between mad doctoring and medicine in the 18th century. You didn't have to be medically qualified to be a mad doctor. Anyone with the capital, the backers or the resources to establish a private madhouse could do it. Equally, there was no complexity about treatment. You didn't have to be a doctor to figure out what you did was to use specific remedies at specific times to quell the mania or the melancholia of your patients. Furthermore, until the end of the 18th century, the vast majority of mad doctors, whether they held to the Lockean view of madness or the Cartesian Boerhaavian view, you were still likely to adhere to the same therapeutic regime, the emetics, the bleedings and the purgings. Most of them really believed that blood or the bowels were the main sources of insanity. Often, the treatments were brutal. The painful physical restraint of confining chairs and straight waistcoats, and of manacles and beatings with whips and cudgels. It was believed that these were all ways of touching the departed reason of the insane. Disorientation and shock were also weapons in the mad doctor's armamentarium. The swinging chair, which could be used to rotate the patient or swing them in a straight line, but to do so with a disorientating, nauseous-making rapidity and motion, was supposed to shock the patient back to reason. So too the rationale for the bridges and walkways that would suddenly be pulled out from under the patient, whoosh, dousing them in the cold water below, near drowning them in the process. All of these therapies were available to the medical and the non-medically qualified alike. And so too, the newly emergent techniques that focused upon the mind and the mind alone, the use of the eye as described by Willis in his testimony to the Royal Commission, was a well-known trick for establishing authority over the mad patient. But authority was also being increasingly exercised by the mad doctor through persuasion and paternal kindliness. Exercise and outdoor work were used by mad doctors like Willis to great effect. And the attempt to engage the patients in routines and normal workaday activities were likewise increasingly used. The mad doctor as the paternal figure presiding over dinner at his institution was well established, well before the asylum and moral therapy. In short, many of the elements that were to become an integral part of moral therapy were in place during the latter part of the 18th century. In fact, looked at this way, the asylum has distinct continuities with the 18th century madhouse. The major difference, however, was a rhetoric around the abandonment of restraints. Even within the more enlightened regimes of Grateford Hall or St Luke's, the competitor to Bedlam, restraint remained an integral part of medicine. Moral therapy, as it was preached by its most ardent advocates, would claim total abandonment of these coercive measures, although in practice there always had to remain a place for restraint. As we will see in the next module, the shading of the madhouse into the asylum was predicated upon the notion that the asylum should be under medical control.